I really do appreciate the time to be here for sure. I've been a volunteer here for a long time. It seems like a long time. It's been at least a couple of years. And although you probably don't even recognize me, even though you see me all the time, right? You probably don't recognize me until you see something like this, till you put in my uniform, and now you go, oh, okay, now I know this guy. He's that guy that's always just following Norm everywhere. That's the guy I am, right? So it's true. So it continues to be an awful lot of fun to be with the community here at Flagler. I came here from a stroke as a result. I mean, it's sort of interesting because a lot of you I've talked to before and others I haven't talked to you about it before. But all of us have our story, right? It just doesn't matter. Unless we were 2 years old right now, we've got nothing but stories. And it just so happens that I have this particular story about having a stroke. And everybody here either had a stroke or a TIA, or they know somebody who did, right? How many people here know something about strokes? Well, look at that. Just about everybody. When I had my stroke, I didn't know anything about strokes. I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about my brain. You know, it's just a noggin that sits up there. I had absolutely no idea of how that would work. And I actually had one of the normal strokes, as I talk about. It's not a TIA. This is a full-out stroke. Fell in the middle of that street right there. You're looking at that picture. Up in Boston. So as I say, that's really what brought me here, is as a result of that stroke. So this turns out to be this wonderful story that actually is wonderful even though I'm here at St. Augustine. I love what I do here. I love being a volunteer here. And the truth of the matter is, I wouldn't have been the same person I am today without the stroke. So you get to that point of saying, this is pretty interesting to actually go through something like this and come through it with enough of a story to talk about. So I do appreciate it to everybody that's here for sure, and I do recognize an awful lot of folks in the room. So it did happen. I had that stroke and I was on that street. As a matter of fact, I was walking on the street. Thank goodness it was about 8:30 at night. You see the date up there. And my wife was just a few feet ahead of me, so she was moving fast. And I was in the middle of the street and felt a click in my head. Felt a click and stopped as I put my foot down and stayed there for a while. I didn't really know what was going on. And we don't know, I don't know how I got there, but I actually got to that standard right there, that yellow traffic sign, and clung to it. That's when my wife was a few feet away, looked back and saw something was wrong, and I made it to that white pole. That's really the only time I really remember anything. I don't know how I got to it. By then my wife came back. But I was sort of smashed up against that pole, and it's full of rust, and that's today. That's the way it still is. And I was just smashed into it like this, so I actually could smell the rust. I really couldn't know how I got there, but I could smell it. So my wife got to me, and I had lost my right side, so that's your right side for me. Most of us with strokes have their stroke typically on the left, and as a result, you lose things on the right. So I lost my right arm and leg. And she said, "Are you having a stroke?" She pretty much figured that's what I was doing. And I don't know how she did it, but and that's it. That's the pole up close. And then once I was on that pole, you turn around. You saw where I was just before. That's where I was there coming off the street. Now she had to get me into that CVS right there. You can imagine how much I love CVS, right? I love CVS today. I couldn't even spell CVS, but today I've talked to them. I'm sure I'll end up speaking for them to say you guys were fantastic. But Laura got me from that pole to the chairs, which are coming up 310 feet long, 310 feet to get me from there to there. I don't even know how I got there. I did not know anything, and Laura's very short. I don't know how she couldn't carry me, but clearly she got me there, and I ended up at those chairs. Now, I was in Boston a couple weeks ago. I took only 5 pictures during the entire first week that I had my stroke, and it was quite by accident that I actually had my iPhone and took 5 pictures, most of which you'll see here. This is not one of those. I was there in Boston last week speaking in a couple other places and went and measured everything, took all these pictures so you would have that exactly what it is. So I was in those chairs, and again, sort of la-la land. If you've ever seen a stroke person like me, you're sort of loopy, didn't really know what was happening, but she sat me in that chair, called 911, and my arm and leg would keep on falling off, and turns out, I remember this, other people tell me now more about it, but I kept picking it up and putting it on my lap. So I was, just sitting there like this, and I keep putting it up, and it would just sort of fall back down, and I go get it and put it back up, but I didn't know what was going on. And I knew that all the people there in the line were looking at me, and I was sort of looking at me. I was sort of like them. I'm saying, I don't understand what's going on, because it's clearly not me, but they're all looking at something. What happened was, I've gone a little bit too far, the EMTs came very quickly. There was about a block away before they came to get me. Excuse me. And I didn't know anything. I was in that chair, didn't know anything until I got into the gurney, right? They're going to take me into the ambulance. And the fellow on my left was visible. I could see him. He was patting me, putting in a saline drip. Not that I knew any of this stuff at the time. But on the right, I couldn't see this guy on the right, but I could hear him a lot. He was doing things. I could feel the thing rocking, and he was so close I actually could feel his breath. So I thought, well, I guess he's right up there. So I didn't know this until he reaches across to strap me in. And he reaches across, and that's when I first saw that his arm comes, it's sliced here. I couldn't see from the right. But there's this clear line, so he reaches here, does his thing, and he goes back. Now at this point I still thought I was part of the public, looking at somebody else, beginning to understand that I was the somebody else they were looking at. And I thought about that for a minute, but I was still sort of loopy. So he does it again. So this arm is just doing this in the air. Literally, it's just like this. It goes back again. I thought, okay, something's going on. And at the next moment, his head reaches in, and there he is, just a head, sliced off here at the neck, doing his thing, fixing these things, and he looked like a balloon with a beard. So it's just bobbing up and down, and at that point, literally at that point, and then his head went back, and now he's breathing, and I realized I can see this guy. Not that I could reach or do anything, but I could see him. This guy was gone. All I knew at that point was something bad has happened, and I've got to start remembering. And they call this episodic memories. So at that time, I remembered my foot when I couldn't move. I remembered sitting in that chair. I remembered when they did all of that, and that's really what shocked me enough to begin to understand that I didn't have the memory, I didn't have those kinds of things that happened at that time, but began to understand that I was the patient, that I was in trouble. And when that happened, because of his head coming back, that was it. So that was the third episodic memory of the entire day, that day. So they got me into the ambulance, took me to MGH in Boston, and so I didn't remember anything in the car, in the thing, but got into the ER. You guys work at ER, you see what people go through. It's very interesting to actually observe somebody who's actually going through that, and then I happen to be actually remembering what was happening to me from the inside. And at that point, we get to the ER, they find out all these kinds of things about strokes and what you can have and can't have. It turns out that there are plenty of medications you cannot get depending on the stroke you have. And I didn't know any of that either, but there are definitely some things, because of your stroke, depending on what it is, will make you worse. You'll actually just plain die. So they will not give you anything until they get there to make sure that you are the kind of stroke you can get, and then move from there. So the next thing that happened was, as I say, they get me to the ER, and eventually, after doing all my tests, they gave me this thing called TPA. Anybody heard of TPA? Anybody? Raise your hand, just so I can see. Okay, enough people understand what TPA means. It's basically like Drano. Just like that. You're going to dissolve a clot, whether it's in your pipes at your kitchen or the pipes that are clogged in your brain. You're getting something that does the same thing, and that TPA dissolves your clot. And you need to get that drug within 3 hours. 3 hours. If you don't, the symptoms of your stroke will become permanent. And it's at that point that they have to decide if you're going to get it or not, given everything else about you, whether you can get it, and whether you can get it within 3 hours. Now, interestingly enough, I had heart surgery 3 months before, had open heart surgery 3 months before the stroke. So they said, because they say, you can't get TPA until 6 months after. Well, I'm 3 months after. So they had a lot of discussion about that, and then they decided, okay, well, if we figured it out, you're the right kind of stroke. If we don't do it, it'll become permanent. She didn't tell me this, she told my wife. What do I know? But if we give it to you, then it's possible that because you have other things that have not yet healed, and you're going to die right here in front of me. It's right here. So they sort of did this and said, Laura, so we can't even ask you. We're going to decide. You're not allowed to, and we're going to give you the drug. So thank God I got TPA. I did get it. I got it within the 3 hours, the magic hours. And believe it or not, the fourth episodic memory of the day happened. It turns out when they put that into you, I started feeling popcorn popping. It happens right here. That's where the stroke was. And it started bow, bow, bow. And I went, oh my God. I was literally, I might as well be a patient laying down, right? I was doing this, and I felt this huge amount of noise popping because it fizzes. I imagine it does. It's just like Drano, right? It's just doing what it has to do to dissolve that stuff. You know, I'm nothing but a clogged pot, right? Pipe. So they do that, and I started doing this, and I started telling Laura that this is what's happening. Well, of course, I wasn't exactly using real language, right? It turns out, and I didn't know this either, this is what comes to the entire operation of me actually collecting all this information, was that this is the ICU where this all happened. I was actually there for 2 days. I had absolutely no idea. But finally they moved me to another room up there. But what I didn't know was that when I was saying, Laura, look at this, something's happening, I hear all this noise, and I'm doing this, Laura was sitting there going, yeah, geez, I don't know what's going on, because all Tom is doing is blah, 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 blah. Although many times you use the same words, they're just completely different words. They're not exactly the words of saying, I am having problems. It was more like blue, green, up, down. It just didn't matter. Words just fell out of the sky. So, and I didn't really know all of that until I ordered this year all of my records from both MGH as well as the rehab hospital where I ended up going later. Got all those records, and every one of them, including penciled notes, and found out, and now we sort of triangulized this operation. When I was doing this, so there was a nurse and Laura who saw me doing that. In the notes of the nurse, she says, infusing TPA, patient speaking word salad. You ever heard that? Anybody here ever heard word salad? I hadn't either. That's what it turns out to be. Nurses use that to explain how a person like me actually tries to talk, communicate, but they call it word salad. So Laura then notices all this, sees me doing this. So sure enough, we put all that together with these notes, and Laura said, and I said, Laura, what's happening? She says, I don't know, you were just doing this and you were talking a lot. And I said, well, I'm telling you that I'm on the inside and this is making a huge amount of racket. And it took about an hour before it subsided, and that was the end of that, and I ended up in my, not that one, but ICU, and then into another one 2 days later. But I didn't know any of that. So we're talking 4 episodic memories that occurred that I remembered, but that was really, I think, the trigger that told me, you have to remember, there's a historian here, you have to document everything, and you don't even know how small it is, yet to find out how important it is to find it out later. And that is what happened to me. I saved everything I possibly could. Unfortunately, I only made 5 photographs during that whole time at the hospital. I wish I'd taken more pictures, because once you have that, you have the date stamp, everything is there, then you can tell that I was actually in that room on that day as opposed to that room on another day, right? I was at this picture one day and I thought, I'm sure it was me. No, it was a week later. Oh, so memory is also part of this, right? Yeah. And literally sometime, well, for several weeks, it went from thinking I could remember like we all remember decades ago, lifetimes ago, for a couple of weeks I didn't remember much at all, as, you know, as these kinds of things go. But what began to happen for me, since I was documenting myself at that time, I was looking at everything, because they said once I was okay physically that morning, or 2 days later when I began to understand it, they said, you can do anything you want. You can just walk around the block, around the floor. We're going to keep you here for a few more days. And they had nothing for me to do at all. So I just sat there and started to look outside, and then began to understand when I said these things, and that happens to be one of the 5 pictures, as were the, I happen to take that, and I happen to take that, so that's 3. 1, 2, 3. I looked at that and began to realize, because nobody else would tell me anything, what is this? I feel fine. I want to go home now. God knows what I actually said. But I began to tell, because I would say it to myself and began to say building. And I actually don't even, I do remember. It sounds a lot like, sounds like that. Skyline. I got to looking at that. I looked at skyscraper, same thing. And at that point I began to understand, and this is all about when you're going through this, it's always about, I began to understand what I'm beginning to understand, what I might understand, what I really might have been thinking. You know, that's how far back you are in terms of grabbing further into the way your mind works. And that's picture number 3, showing, in fact, that I could not understand even those things from my floor. This is picture number 4, and I think I actually took one of them out. Yep, I took one of them out because the other one was another view of MGH, but that's the 4th and then the 5th that I left on that Saturday. What was interesting was, of course, that I couldn't read, write, or speak well. And this is where it really becomes the rub, right? This is all of you. Anybody would say, well, wait a minute. You said you can't read, write, or speak, yet you kept a diary. Again, now we go back to whether you're an engineer or a historian or you want to document things, this all comes together to say you need to document everything you possibly can, because there are very few people like me that basically go over the cliff. It's just like in a movie. Somebody falls down, you think they're dead, everybody's crying, and the hero comes climbing up the other side and says, what are you guys doing? It's exactly what happens to me. So there are very few people that actually get thrown over that cliff and find your way back and then tell the tale. Because it's interesting to tell the tale, because what we begin to see is that is how our brain actually works. Now I have a long way to go to actually understand how our brain actually works, but this is all part of that story, because I did keep track of it. This there that you're looking at is my first diary. So you see that I had my diary, I had my stroke on September 26th. I started my diary on October 27th and wrote that down. You'll see it in the book, but I think you can see there, you can read those words. They all look like they are all real words, right? Can you tell them? They're not only real words, they don't make any sense, but you'll see that I actually misspelled one of those words. What do you see there? Calendar. Misspelled. So in the middle of not being able to communicate what I wanted to say, I still found that one of those words was spelled wrong, fixed it, it still makes no sense. That was the first day of all of this work going on. And what began to make it understanding really for me, because even though you see this text, you'll see a lot of those drawings. What really then turned out, again, not that I knew this. Remember, I really didn't know this at the time. I actually went for 7 months writing things. I actually have volume 1 right there. All the words below them, you would see they looked an awful lot like that. Didn't make any sense whatsoever. So you'll see that when you get to see the book. You'll be able to look at some of these things, many, which meant an awful lot to me. Now as I read them now, I can better understand what it was I was trying to make then. Excuse me, and that is how aphasia works. And it all depends on who you are, what your stroke is, and how aphasia affects you. Because it turns out that I actually could speak reasonably well, and also recorded myself in addition to my diary, writing it down. I went and made another 150 personal recordings almost every day of what I was saying. Then I began to realize that when I said this thing, when I wrote it down the same day, when I went to see a speech therapist the same day, now you're triangulating again, and you could look at those three things and begin to go, oh, so that means I was actually saying this, doing it pretty well when I spoke it, writing it completely terribly, but now looking at the image, the drawing, and understanding that the way aphasia works is that you have any number of deficits that are each individually damaged in their own individual way. Again, didn't know any of this. But after 7 months, and at the end of this 20-minute presentation, you really come to the end. That is April 30th. That's the last time I used that diary until I moved here. To move here because I lost my job up north. And you'll see here that's in that cloud thing, that's my last sentence. You can see that the words continue to make sense. They might have even looked like, because you start having, instead of one word, you'll have two or three. They start to make a little more sense. So if you read that and say, okay, I'm seeing more sense. And at the bottom you see it, okay, still not a whole lot of sense. But that's the end of the diary that day. And I spent 5 weeks, packed that up, moved down here, started here, and actually because I loved my hospitals, love CBS, love all the things that have anything to do with your stroke. I love volunteers and wanted to come here as a volunteer and came here to interview. Look at that date. Look at the people on that date. Some of the people in this room are on that page. Clara is one of them. Joan is another, she left. Who else might be there? Paul was there. So I was interviewed. Thank God I got the job. Because I wanted to be a volunteer, because so many volunteers had helped with me. But what you see there too is, what do you see in terms of my language? It all made reasonable sense. Reasonable sense, right? So we go through something that the scientists tell you about called spontaneous recovery. It depends on your stroke, it depends on the drug, it depends on your health, intelligence, you name it all. But if you all those things, then typically at 6.5 to 7 months, do the math, it was just about 7 months, you will go through something called spontaneous recovery, where literally the day before, metaphorically, the day before was right there, April 30th, the next day I wrote again was right there. And you can tell for the first time, and I began to tell, I actually didn't know that for another 2 more months. I was still somewhat dazed. I did not know that that was there until 2 months later, when I began to understand that the entire 7 months were nothing but a whole bunch of gobbledygook that I thought was otherwise right. But when I learned about that and spontaneous recovery, that is where many of my doctors at that time had already begun to tell me, you need to write this book. Because there just aren't that many people that can actually witness spontaneous recovery. Literally, if it had happened overnight, it would have been overnight. And I wrote it all down when it happened. Right after this happened here, I realized what had happened, and starting on August 1st, for several pages, I wrote down exactly what had just happened to my brain. And from that day to this day, when I said I couldn't read, I swore I would never read again unless it was about the brain, about stroke, about spontaneous recovery, about Broca's area. These are things that me as a naval engineer had never thought about before. So, thank you very much for having me here today. I really appreciate it again.